Frank Gusenberg. Frank Gusenberg, circa 1892, February 14, 1929, was an American criminal and enforcer affiliated with the North Side Gang led by George Bugs Moran during the Prohibition-era gang conflicts in Chicago. Known for involvement in burglaries, robberies, and violent enforcement, he was one of 7 men gunned down in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre on February 14, 1929, at a Lincoln Park garage, an event widely attributed to rivals from the Chicago Outfit. Despite sustaining 14 gunshot wounds, Gusenberg survived long enough to be questioned by police but refused to name his attackers, reportedly stating "nobody shot me" in adherence to the underworld omertà before succumbing to his injuries later that day. His Colt .38 special revolver, recovered from the massacre scene, exemplifies the armaments typical of the era's bootlegging wars. Early life and background. Childhood and family origins. Frank Gusenberg was born on October 11, 1893, in Chicago's Lakeview neighborhood to Peter Gusenberg Sr., a first-generation immigrant from Gusenberg in Germany's Trier-Saarburg district, and his wife. As the second oldest child, Gusenberg grew up alongside 3 siblings, including an older brother, Peter Gussie Gusenberg, born September 22, 1888, and 2 younger siblings, a brother and a sister, in a working-class immigrant household on Chicago's North Side. The family's early 20th century environment reflected the challenges faced by many German-American households in urban Chicago, including economic pressures from industrial growth and dense immigrant settlements. Initial involvement in crime. Gusenberg's documented entry into criminal activity began in his mid-teens amid Chicago's burgeoning underworld, with involvement in petty theft alongside his brother Peter and associates like George Bugs Moran. By 1909, at age 16, he received a fine under the alias Carl Bloom for an initial charge, marking his first recorded brush with the law. From 1909 to 1914, Gusenberg emerged as a suspect in multiple armed robberies and burglaries across the Chicago area, reflecting a rapid escalation from minor theft to violent property crimes typical of the era's street gangs. He faced trial for robbery during this period, though conviction details remain sparse in available records. These offenses, often conducted with firearms, honed his role as an enforcer and laid the groundwork for deeper immersion in organized illicit operations as Prohibition commenced in 1920, shifting focus toward bootlegging enforcement and territorial disputes. Criminal career. Association with the North Side Gang. Frank Gusenberg aligned with the North Side Gang, a predominantly Irish-American criminal syndicate active in Chicago during the Prohibition era of the 1920s. The organization, initially formed under Dean O'Banion and later led by George Bugs Moran following O'Banion's 1924 murder, focused on bootlegging illegal alcohol as its primary revenue source amid nationwide temperance laws. The North Side Gang exerted control over territories north of the Chicago River, encompassing neighborhoods from Lincoln Park to Rogers Park, where it dominated liquor distribution networks and associated rackets. This positioned the gang in direct opposition to Al Capone's Chicago Outfit, an Italian-dominated faction that held sway over the South Side and sought to expand northward. Gusenberg, of German descent, integrated into this ethnic mix as a key operative under Moran's leadership. In his capacity as an enforcer, Gusenberg handled the violent aspects of sustaining the gang's operations, including the intimidation and coercion tied to protection schemes that shielded bootlegging enterprises from competitors and ensured compliance from speakeasies and distributors. His role emphasized physical enforcement rather than strategic planning, aligning with the gang's reliance on armed retainers to defend turf amid escalating inter-gang hostilities. Key criminal activities and enforcer role. Frank Gusenberg functioned as a key enforcer for the North Side Gang, executing targeted hits and drive-by shootings to neutralize competitors and secure illicit operations during Prohibition-era Chicago. His tactics relied on swift, opportunistic violence, frequently utilizing concealable handguns such as his Colt 38 special revolver, which allowed for effective engagement in confined urban settings and rapid escapes. A verified instance of his involvement occurred in the January 8, 1929, murder of Pasqualino Lolordo, a Union Sicilian leader aligned with rival factions, who was shot 13 times in his home parlor at approximately 5 p.m. Gusenberg collaborated with his brother Peter Gusenberg and Albert Kachalek in the ambush, entering the residence to deliver close-range fire that ensured the target's elimination with minimal collateral disruption. Gusenberg further demonstrated his enforcer proficiency through repeated assassination attempts on Jack "Machine Gun" McGurn, a prominent adversary, including an unsuccessful operation with Peter Gusenberg approximately 1 week following the Lolordo killing. These efforts involved coordinated positioning for ambushes, reflecting a pattern of persistent targeting to disrupt enemy leadership and operations. Historical records attribute to Gusenberg a series of such enforcements, often in tandem with familial allies, yielding high operational success rates in an environment where survival hinged on preemptive elimination of threats. His approach prioritized firepower volume and brotherly synchronization, contributing to the North Side's maintenance of bootlegging territories through documented lethality. Conflicts with the Chicago Outfit. The rivalry between the North Side Gang and the Chicago Outfit escalated in the mid-1920s amid fierce competition for control of Chicago's illegal alcohol trade, which generated an estimated $500 million annually citywide due to Prohibition's ban on licensed production and distribution under the Volstead Act of 1920. The outfit, dominated by Italian-American figures like Al Capone after Johnny Torrio's semi-retirement in 1925, sought to expand northward from its South Side strongholds, encroaching on territories held by the Irish-dominated North Side Gang under George Bugs Moran, who inherited operations from Dean O'Banion following his 1924 murder by outfit gunmen. This territorial contest was fundamentally economic. Bootlegging involved sourcing, smuggling, and wholesaling liquor from Canada and domestic distilleries, with gangs enforcing monopolies through violence to secure supply chains and speakeasy customers, leading to over 500 gang-related homicides in Chicago between 1924 and 1929. Frank Gusenberg and his brother Peter, acting as enforcers and contract killers for Moran, directly contributed to the cycle of retaliation by targeting outfit affiliates to disrupt Capone's alliances and leadership structures. In 1928, the brothers reportedly attempted to assassinate Jack "Machine Gun" McGurn, Capone's top hitman responsible for earlier North Side losses like the 1926 killing of Himmy Weiss, though McGurn survived the ambush. More critically, North Side operatives, including the Gusenbergs, were linked to the September 10, 1928, murder of Antonio Lombardo, Capone's hand-picked president of the Union Sicilian, a fraternal organization Capone leveraged for political influence and Italian community extortion tied to bootlegging protection, shot outside a restaurant in retaliation for outfit involvement in Brooklyn mobster Frankie Yale's July 1928 death. This was followed by the January 8, 1929, assassination of Lombardo's successor, Pasqualino Lolordo, gunned down in his apartment. The hit, aimed at further eroding Capone's Sicilian network used to import and distribute alcohol, exemplified how such strikes were calculated to impose economic costs by eliminating intermediaries and sowing distrust among suppliers. These actions reflected causal dynamics of the Prohibition economy, where assassinations served not just vengeance but strategic deterrence. North Side hits weakened outfit revenue streams by targeting figures who facilitated cross-ethnic partnerships essential for scaling bootlegging operations amid federal enforcement pressures. However, they provoked disproportionate outfit responses, as Capone's superior resources, bolstered by South Side political corruption and larger manpower, enabled more organized counterstrikes, perpetuating the bloodshed until external interventions like federal tax probes eroded both gangs' foundations. Personal life, marriages, and relationships. Frank Gusenberg maintained 2 simultaneous marriages, practicing bigamy without the knowledge of either spouse. He was wed to Lucille Gusenberg and Ruth Gusenberg concurrently, as documented in contemporary accounts of his personal affairs amid his criminal activities. No records indicate that either union produced children, and historical reports from police and coroners' investigations reveal no additional documented relationships or family obligations that notably influenced his private life. These arrangements reflect the compartmentalized existence typical of figures in Prohibition-era organized crime, where personal entanglements were kept separate from professional demands. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Prelude to the event. The SMC Cartage Company garage at 2122 North Clark Street in Chicago served as a key operational hub for the North Side Gang's bootlegging enterprise, where members stored, processed, and distributed hijacked liquor shipments amid the Prohibition-era turf wars. This location facilitated the gang's aggressive hijacking tactics against rival shipments, particularly those bound for Al Capone's Chicago Outfit, heightening mutual hostilities through repeated interceptions and retaliatory violence. By late 1928, escalating bounties and assassinations had intensified the conflict, with Bugs Moran reportedly placing a $50,000 bounty on Capone's head. A provocation that prompted Capone to direct the systematic elimination of Moran's top lieutenants to dismantle the North Side leadership. Capone's operatives, leveraging intelligence from informants within or around Moran's circle, identified opportunities to exploit the gang's routines, including fixed meeting points like the Clark Street garage. This intelligence underscored strategic vulnerabilities in the North Side's operations, as Moran himself narrowly avoided the site due to a delayed arrival. Frank Gusenberg, a seasoned enforcer and Moran associate, positioned himself at the garage on February 14, 1929, alongside his brother Pete and several others, primarily to oversee the anticipated delivery of a hijacked bootleg whiskey shipment, a standard procedure that concentrated key personnel without heightened security precautions. This gathering reflected a tactical oversight, as the predictable nature of such transfers allowed Capone's planners to time their intervention precisely, capitalizing on the absence of Moran while targeting subordinates like the Gusenbergs who routinely handled enforcement and logistics. The Massacre and Gusenberg's wounding. On February 14, 1929, around 10:30 a.m., for gunmen, 2 dressed in police uniforms and 2 in civilian attire, entered the SMC Cartage Company garage at 2122 North Clark Street in Chicago, where 7 members and associates of the North Side Gang were present. The assailants, believed to be acting on orders from Al Capone's Chicago Outfit and possibly including enforcers linked to Jack Machine Gun McGurn, ordered the victims to line up against the interior brick wall under the pretense of a police raid. The gunmen then unleashed a barrage using 2 Thompson submachine guns and a shotgun, firing more than 70 rounds in under 2 minutes, with ballistic evidence showing the victims were executed while standing in a row, their bodies riddled with concentrated gunfire to the head, chest, and abdomen. Frank Gusenberg, a seasoned enforcer, absorbed 14 bullet wounds yet demonstrated remarkable resilience by not collapsing immediately. He was discovered by arriving officers crawling toward the side door, revolver in hand. Gusenberg's Colt .38 special revolver, recovered unloaded at the scene, suggested he had fired all 6 rounds in an attempt to defend himself amid the ambush, underscoring the intensity of the close-quarters assault. Forensic analysis confirmed the systematic nature of the killings, with shell casings from .45 caliber Thompson guns scattered across the garage floor, aligning with the positioned execution style. Death and immediate aftermath. Hospitalization and final statements. Frank Gusenberg, the sole survivor initially transported alive from the St. Valentine's Day Massacre scene on February 14, 1929, was rushed by ambulance to Election Brothers Hospital in Chicago, where he received emergency treatment for multiple gunshot wounds. Despite sustaining 14 bullet wounds from Thompson submachine guns and shotguns, including critical injuries to his torso and limbs, Gusenberg remained conscious and capable of speech for approximately 3 hours post-shooting. Chicago police officers, led by Sergeant Clarence Sweeney, interrogated Gusenberg at his bedside in an attempt to identify the perpetrators, but he adhered strictly to the underworld code of silence. When directly asked who had shot him, Gusenberg reportedly replied, "No one, nobody shot me," a statement that exemplified gangster omertà and yielded no investigative leads. This response, documented in contemporaneous police accounts and later biographies, frustrated authorities seeking to link the attack to the Chicago outfit. Gusenberg succumbed to exsanguination and internal trauma from his gunshot wounds later that afternoon, becoming the 7th confirmed fatality of the massacre and closing the window for any potential testimony. His defiance in death underscored the interpersonal loyalty and reticence characteristic of Prohibition-era mob enforcers, with no evidence emerging from his final hours to implicate specific rivals. Funeral and investigation implications. The joint funeral for Frank Gusenberg and his brother Peter, also killed in the massacre, occurred on February 19, 1929, at a Chicago funeral home, drawing crowds amid heavy floral tributes, including a heart-shaped arrangement believed sent by North Side Gang leader Bugs Moran. The brothers were initially interred in Rose Hill Cemetery before being reburied at Irving Park Cemetery in Chicago, where their graves remain. Attendance reflected underworld solidarity, with gangster funerals typically attracting associates despite police surveillance, underscoring the mob's code of loyalty even in death. Gusenberg's adherence to omertà, refusing to identify his assailants despite 14 gunshot wounds, deprived investigators of direct testimony that could have implicated Chicago outfit members, as he uttered only "nobody shot me" upon arrival at the hospital. This silence exemplified the gangsters' pact of non-cooperation with law enforcement, a causal barrier rooted in fear of retaliation and cultural norms imported from Sicilian mafia traditions, limiting probes reliant on witness accounts. The implications extended to the massacre's enduring unsolved status. Without Gusenberg's cooperation or that of other potential informants, forensic evidence like Thompson submachine gun casings failed to yield convictions for the killings themselves, despite linking weapons to later crimes by suspects such as Fred "Killer" Burke. Police frustration was palpable, with Chicago authorities decrying the wall of silence that protected Al Capone's network, enabling no prosecutions tied directly to the event and highlighting systemic enforcement challenges in Prohibition-era gang warfare where intimidation deterred testimony. This non-cooperation perpetuated impunity, as verifiable leads evaporated absent voluntary disclosures, constraining causal chains from evidence to accountability. Legacy and depictions. Impact on Chicago gang wars. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre on February 14, 1929, in which Frank Gusenberg sustained fatal wounds alongside 6 other North Side gang associates, critically undermined Bugs Moran's organization by eliminating experienced enforcers essential for defending bootlegging operations. Gusenberg, recognized as one of Moran's most ruthless gunmen, exemplified the caliber of talent lost, reducing the gang's capacity to retaliate or maintain territorial control amid escalating rivalries with the Chicago outfit. This decapitation of leadership and muscle shifted the balance, as the North Side's diminished firepower curtailed effective resistance to outfit incursions. Post-massacre dynamics evidenced a rapid consolidation of power by Al Capone's outfit, which exploited the North Side's vulnerabilities to dominate Chicago's bootlegging rackets, previously contested through violent turf wars. Empirical indicators include a marked drop in bootlegging-related gangland killings, falling below 20 in 1929 following a temporary peace, and the North Side Gang's operational collapse by late 1930, as Moran resorted to minor robberies unable to rebuild his network. The outfit's unchallenged expansion into North Side territories facilitated near-total control over the city's illicit alcohol supply chains until Capone's 1931 imprisonment and Prohibition's 1933 repeal. Causally, the massacre's toll, including Gusenberg's demise, escalated one-sided outfit aggression by removing credible deterrence, transforming the Chicago gang wars from bidirectional conflict into outfit hegemony and hastening the North Side's marginalization in the 1930s underworld hierarchy. This outcome reflected not mere happenstance but the strategic elimination of adversarial muscle, enabling outfit efficiencies in distribution and enforcement that prior parody had precluded. Representations in media and culture. Frank Gusenberg's defiance in his final hours has been a focal point in cinematic depictions of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, symbolizing the gangster omertà. In Roger Corman's 1967 film The St. Valentine's Day Massacre, Gusenberg is portrayed by David Canary as a key North Side gang enforcer gunned down in the garage ambush, with the narrative emphasizing the hit's execution and the victim's silence under interrogation. The portrayal aligns with historical accounts of Gusenberg's refusal to name his attackers, though the film takes dramatic liberties in compressing the gang rivalry timeline for narrative flow. Gusenberg also appears in the 1975 biopic Capone, directed by Steve Carver, where his role in the massacre sequence underscores Al Capone's ruthless consolidation of power, though specific actor portrayals in this context prioritize ensemble mob violence over individual character depth. True crime literature, such as detailed histories of Prohibition-era Chicago, often references Gusenberg's last words, "No one shot me," as emblematic of loyalty to the North Side outfit, while noting scholarly skepticism about the exact phrasing as potentially embellished by reporters for sensationalism. Cultural artifacts tied to Gusenberg include his cult detective Special 38 revolver, carried during the massacre and later acquired by the Mob Museum in Las Vegas, where it is displayed as evidence of the era's armed underworld ethos. The weapon, serialized and authenticated through provenance, highlights the personal firepower wielded by gang triggermen. Exhibits at the museum contextualize such items within broader narratives of organized crime enforcement failures, avoiding romanticization by focusing on forensic and ballistic details. Recent true crime analyses, like those examining unsolved aspects of the hit, portray Gusenberg not as a mythic survivor but as a disposable foot soldier whose brief hospitalization yielded no leads, debunking persistent rumors of fake death or hidden testimony through hospital records confirming his death from 14 wounds on February 14, 1929.